Our third video for today is an analysis of a film that I worked with during my sabbatical. I want to do a Burkean analysis of this film. The film is called The Front Page. It was originally a play written by Ben Hecht and Charles MacArthur. Hecht and MacArthur's play was published in the late 20s. Both Hecht and MacArthur, particularly Hecht, were newspapermen. Ben Hecht was a newspaperman in Chicago, worked for the Chicago American, I believe. I'd have to go back to my notes, which I don't really want to do right at this point because it's irrelevant. MacArthur worked for the New York Times. They knew each other through newspaper circles. There were a lot of papers in Chicago at the time. In the early 20th century up through the 1950s, Chicago sported four major daily papers. In the 1950s, the papers began to disappear. There were also some minor dailies, one of which is still published, the oldest and largest circulation African-American newspaper. The Daily Defender is published in Chicago. But at this time, there were a number of papers. The play takes place in a courthouse in Chicago. The courthouse is still there. And next to the courthouse is the square on which they're going to hang the victim, or hang the convict, the person who's been convicted of murdering a police officer, happened to be a black police officer. As background, there's a mayoral election underway, mayoral campaign underway, and the sheriff, this is the county building, the sheriff is ally of the current mayor who is running for re-election. The newspaper is opposed to the sheriff's re-election, or to the mayor's re-election, believes that he is corrupt, and is looking for a way to expose him. The hero of this play is a fellow by the name of Hildy Johnson, or that's how he's introduced. This character is based, as all of the journalists in the play are based upon actual journalists of Chicago that Hecht knew during his period working in journalism in Chicago. This hero is based upon a fellow by the name of Hilding Johnson, Swedish-born, a Swedish-American, immigrated to this country when he was very young, but he's known in the play version as a lucky Swede, or Swede Johnson. He is called Swede 3 times in Act 1 in the play, and is clearly identified as a Swedish-American. Now, in the movie, he's called Swede or Lucky Swede just once, and the rest of the references to him as a Swede disappear. So my question was, why is it that these references to Hilding as a Swede disappear? Let's take a look at a clip that shows Hilding being called a Swede.
He wouldn't have. Got him into a fight and had him thrown into jail for assault and battery.
Give me a rewrite.
Well, if he ain't quit, why ain't he here covering the hanger? I wish I could quit.
Ready? Nurse Isabel's elbow. Z for zebra, O for onion, B for baptize, E for anything, L for,
Oh, don't tell him anybody.
L for Listerine. Swedish masseuse, with rooms at 608 Inverness Avenue. Well, this dame was arrested tonight on complaint of a lot of angry wives. They claim she's been treating their husbands with electricity at $1 a time.
Well, the Swedish tease is in again. I understand she massages them, too.
Well, anyway, she's arrested, and the station house is full of her patients claiming she's innocent. Half the stock exchange is there, too, trying to provide bail. All right.
Don't work too much the first day, kid.
Goodbye, Johnson.
I'll drop you a line, Hildy, and let you know what Walter says.
So long, Hildy. Be careful of that treacherous New York weather, Hildy. So long, Plant. Don't forget to send us a postal card.
Don't forget to drop in and see us if you ever come back, kid.
Well, we see you again, Hildy. Riding in a Rolls Royce, giving out interviews on Success.
That's it. That's the reference to Hilding as a Swede in the movie, in the film. And certainly he doesn't look like a Swede in the film. He's played by Pat O'Brien, an Irishman. And this is O'Brien's first major role in Hollywood. Hecht was not a Swede, but Hecht knew Hildy Johnson, and Hildy was, in fact, as I've said, a Swede. So the question is, why does it disappear? And I think that one of the ways we can get at that issue of why does the ethnic identity of Hilding Johnson disappear from the stage play to the movie, we can get at that by looking at Burke's Dramatistic Pentad, and in particular what Burke calls the scene-act ratio. When Burke talks about this, as he does in A Grammar of Motives, Burke says that we act according to the place where we act. In other words, our act is fitted to the scene. And by scene, he doesn't just mean the scene within the movie, in the courthouse, but he means the scene in American life. In the 1920s, Swedes were a large part of the Chicago scene. Swedes, in the 1910 census, Swedes were the second largest minority, immigrant minority within Chicago. In fact, Chicago was the second largest Swedish town outside of Sweden. The second largest Swedish town anywhere. It was Stockholm, Chicago, Gothenburg in terms of Swedish population. They dominated several neighborhoods in Chicago, both on the north side and the south side, and left their mark on it. The South Side High School, known as Lindblom High School, was named for a Chicago Swede. Matter of fact, he was an architect who designed several buildings within Andersonville, a north side neighborhood. The Swedes were quite populous and fairly powerful within the Chicago establishment. Most of them were Republicans, as was the leadership of Chicago's political parties. Chicago knew what it was to have a large Swedish immigrant population. Chicago also knew what it was to be corrupt. The sheriff and mayor who were pilloried in this play were Chicago fixtures. If you look back into the period in which Hecht is writing this play, you discover that the mayor was indeed corrupt, was indeed seen as corrupt, and was indeed pilloried for being corrupt. The Chicago Tribune, not Hecht's paper, but a competitor, the Tribune pilloried the mayor on several occasions during this period for his corruption. So you have a play that takes place in a noticeable Chicago monument, the Cook County Courthouse on near North Side, with characters who were recognizable to a Chicago audience as being journalists they knew, including characters who had a Swedish identification, an immigrant population that was well known throughout the city, and a mayor and sheriff who were as corrupt as the historic mayor and sheriff. When this goes to Broadway, those things remain, perhaps as vestiges of the Chicago setting, but when it goes to Hollywood, even in its first production in Hollywood, the Chicago references disappear. We don't realize that we're in Chicago going to go to New York City. In the second iteration of this film, an iteration in which the gender of Hildy Johnson is changed from a male to a female, and Hildy becomes a romantic foil for the newspaper editor, suddenly all of Chicago references are gone, and in fact the play takes place in New York City, with the move being made to upstate New York, the corruption being lost, everything Chicago about it being lost. In the next iteration of the play, a movie starring Jack Lemmon as Hildy Johnson, again, the Swede doesn't come back, neither does the Chicago reference. What I maintain is that the scene of the play has changed from the localized Chicago scene to the nationalized movie scene. That when you bring it to the big screen, you can't use Chicago the way you could when you had it on stage. You see the same phenomenon happening in other movies of the period. The next Ben Hecht movie, in fact, is the first version of Scarface. And Scarface is really a movie based upon the life of Al Capone, who was known as Scarface. So it's again a Chicago movie. But when it goes to Hollywood, the Chicago reference in the Chicago locale is lost. Of course, It's totally lost in the next iteration of Scarface, in which Al Pacino plays Scarface, and it's set in Miami, and we have the Cuban Mafia rather than the Chicago Mafia. So our insight that we gain from using Burke is that the scene changes the act, so that instead of being a very localized and particular satire of Chicago politics and Chicago journalism, when we go to Hollywood, it becomes just a general screwball comedy all about life within a particular journalistic setting. You wouldn't think that the setting of someone waiting to be hung could make good screwball comedy. But in fact, Hecht has written what is fundamentally a screwball comedy, and for which the scene is not absolutely necessary. So, scene changes act. That's what Burke teaches when he talks about the dramatistic pentad, and in particular, the ratios between scene and act. Now, what are you going to do with it? You can get a copy of the Grammar of Motives in our library. The first few chapters, I believe it's through chapter 3, will give you all that you need to know about the dramatistic pentad and the dramatistic ratios: scene, act, act, agent, agent, agency, purpose, scene, all the things that you need to know in order to do an analysis. And just as I've done an analysis now verbally, I want to hear from you. What do you think you might want to do? What did you think of trying to do class in this fashion? That is, me on the video with you giving a video response. Let me know. I'm asking one member of the class to bring your responses, to record them to YouTube, and to let me know what you think. Okay, see you on Friday, and we'll go a little further with the whole idea of media analysis. But on Friday, we'll turn to media analysis as if media were an industry. Talk to you then. Bye.